The first time you read this passage, you'll assume that the reason he was the talk of the land was because he had a cock that was 6 foot long. Then you might think, well, that's impossible. He couldn't have had a cock 6 foot long. But maybe he just had a really big cock, and that could still be the reason he was the talk of all the land. Hello and welcome to Grey Sheep and Hedge Wizards, my Song of Ice and Fire show, where I talk about A Song of Ice and Fire. With me, Apples and Dragons. If you have not read all of those books, you should. Go away. But seriously, they're really good. And until you've read all of the published A Song of Ice and Fire books, at least up to the date of this video, November 2023, you should hold off on watching my videos. And today's topic is going to be Aegon the Targaryen the Unworthy, Part 3. A continuation of last time. So last time we did a deep dive into one sentence from the Aegon the section of The World of Ice and Fire. And the sentence was on page 95, and it was, "He deprived men of their rightful inheritance when he desired their wealth, as rumors claim he did following the death of Lord Plum upon his wedding day." And we started off by challenging that sentence in the most simple way that we could. Who were the men that Aegon deprived of their rightful inheritance? Then we found that nobody was deprived of their rightful inheritance, and that this injustice that Aegon IV is being accused of perpetrating is a victimless crime. That Aegon is the real father of Viserys Plum, and that if Aegon had not fathered Viserys Plum, he wouldn't have been born to inherit anything. And so if anything, Viserys and all of his descendants actually owe Aegon IV their inheritances. And the fact that Aegon IV impregnated Aelena after Ossifer Plum died. And now I'm going to follow up on a lot of the things I said in that previous episode. Because having continued the investigation, I learned a lot of new things about it myself. In part 2, I called Aelena Targaryen a villain. And I said that maybe I wouldn't think she was a villain if I were a person who lives in Westeros and has Westerosi attitudes. And I said that Aelena Targaryen and Ossifer Plum's marriage is a rhyme, a historical rhyme, of Lysa Tully and Jon Arryn's marriage in the A Song of Ice and Fire series proper. What we might call the present day, at least in the story. And these two marriages are separated by about 100 years. It's probably a little more or less, but about 100 years. So they're only related to each other in a role-based way, where the roles are something like young noble princess marries rich old lord who desperately needs an heir before he dies. And I applied a kind of analysis that I called complete the rhyme. And the way it works is that when I find a situation from the present day or from history that rhymes with another situation from the present day or from history, I let knowns from one era fill in unknowns from the era that I want to understand. In this case, the situation in the era that I wanted to understand was Ossifer Plum and Aelena's marriage, in the days of the reign of Aegon IV. In the era that rhymes with it was the present-day era, or near to present day, between Lysa Tully and Jon Arryn. The known that I took from Lysa and Jon's marriage, to fill in an unknown, or to complete the rhyme, of Aelena and Ossifer's marriage, was soiling. And you might be wondering, why did you take soiling? There are all kinds of facts about Lysa and Jon Arryn's marriage that I could have tried to apply to Aelena and Ossifer's marriage to try to help me understand it better. So why did I take that one? And the reason I knew to take that one is because I'm familiar with the Lysa and Jon Arryn debates in the audience, the Song of Ice and Fire audience. Or maybe lack of a debate is more to the point. Readers agree practically across the board that the appropriate interpretation of Lysa and Jon Arryn's marriage is that Lysa is the victim of a very corrupt society in which she was forced to marry an old man who she wasn't attracted to and to have sex with him and to give birth to his children, and that the roles of the situation mostly distribute like this. Lysa Tully is the victim. Her father Hoster Tully is the main villain for forcing or compelling her to marry Jon Arryn. And Jon Arryn is the beneficiary of an evil and corrupt society in which the forcing of women to marry men who they didn't choose is normal. It's a reasonable interpretation, because if the situation were to happen in our modern day, that would be the appropriate interpretation, because we don't live in a society where women are compelled to marry men that they didn't choose. But it's a mistake to apply our modern standards to the story, because that's how stories work. They have to be interpreted in their own context. The right way to approach the situation is to extract the common opinion of the characters in the story, and then apply those standards to the situation. And when you seek out what other characters say, think, and feel about situations like this, you find that the characters have attitudes about this sort of situation that are extremely contrary to the ones that the readers have about it. In story, the general attitude of the characters is that a woman who has had sex before marriage has devalued her marriage prospects greatly. When you apply in-story standards, the roles are more like this. Lysa Tully is the villain for disobeying her father and society about having sex before marriage, and having sex before marriage. And Hoster Tully is doing what every noble parent would do by arranging and compelling marriages for his children. And Jon Arryn is a hero who's making a sacrifice by agreeing to marry a soiled bride. So one side of the debate's takeaway from the Jon Arryn-Lysa Tully situation is going to be that the story is a criticism of society, or patriarchal societies, or feudal societies. The commonality between those three interpretations being a criticism of society. And so the essence of the interpretation is that the story is a criticism of society. And the other, much smaller side of the argument's takeaway from the situation is that Lysa Arryn should have simply obeyed her father to begin with, and not had sex before marriage. Lysa Arryn having sex before marriage, and apparently getting pregnant from it, with Peter Baelish, was the reason that her fertility was proven. And her fertility being proven was the reason that she was married to Jon Arryn, an old lord who's at risk of dying without an heir. So Lysa Arryn having sex when she's not supposed to, what the characters in the story call soiling, is the thing about the Lysa and Jon Arryn marriage that connects the undesirableness of Lysa's situation to Lysa's own actions. And that makes soiling the essence of the Lysa and Jon Arryn debates. Because it's the key insight about the situation that arms one side of the debate, disarms the other, and renders a winner of the interpretation. And soiling being the essence of that debate is the reason that as soon as I noticed that Ossifer Plum and Olenna's marriage was a rhyme of Jon and Lysa's marriage, I knew that soiling was how I complete the rhyme. It's the known in the present era that I need to import to the past era to help me understand that situation too. I think that's super cool. And that was how I knew what to look for next in the Ossifer Plum and Olenna situation. I went, I wonder if Olenna got pregnant before marriage too. Maybe that's why. This 26-year-old woman married an old, frail man. And lo and behold, when you turn backwards 2 pages, you can read the story of Olenna in King Baelor's section that tells about, quote, she bore the bastard twins John and Jane Waters to Alan Valerian, Lord Oakenfist. She hoped to wed him, it is written, but a year after his disappearance at sea, she gave up hope and agreed to marry elsewhere. She had babies with Alan Valerian, but apparently he went off to sea before they married and never came back. But that is the risk a woman takes in this setting, when she has sex with a man before marriage. But apparently seeing the opportunity in it, she realized, I'm a woman of proven fertility now, and that's just what the wealthy Ossifer Plum needs. So I'll marry him. He probably won't live much longer, and when he dies, I'll inherit his fortune. But the thing I wanted to highlight about this situation is how it's optimized to arm one side of the argument and disarm the other side. In order to defend Lysa's sex before marriage, in the Lysa and Jon Arryn situation, the reader has to ignore an in-story morals interpretation and apply a modern morals interpretation. But in order to defend Aelena in the Aelena and Ossifer situation, the reader has to do a complete 180 on those positions, denouncing a modern morals interpretation and arguing in favor of an in-story morals interpretation. I said that the Aelena and Ossifer marriage is an offshoot of the Lysa and Jon Arryn marriage. But really what I should have said is that it's an expansion of it. Because it expands on the debates in the audience that the first situation evoked. The next thing I wanted to talk about was about the wealth. I sort of jumped the gun by calling Aegon a hero. And at the time I said it, I hadn't advanced far enough in the investigation to be able to say it with certainty. I'm just familiar enough with the way the story works that I knew that that had to be the resolution that the situation was leading towards. But I found it now, so let's finish that. I pointed out that it wasn't actually Aegon but Aelena who received House Plum's wealth. And having received it, it's reasonable to suppose that wealth was actually Aelena's motivation rather than Aegon's. And that apparently what the historian did was he took the motivation of Aelena and grafted it onto Aegon. Oh, here's an unflattering motivation. Well, I don't want that to be on Aelena. She was the master of coin to King Daeron. Let's move that motivation over to Aegon and make him look more evil because he said that Daeron is illegitimate. When Aegon impregnated Aelena, both he and Aelena effectively rescued House Plum from extinction. Not their genetics, but their name. So it's kind of a heroic thing to do on both of their parts. Granted, Aelena is inheriting a fortune for doing it, and Aegon isn't. But it's actually worse than that for Aegon. Because the way a house extinction works is that when a house goes extinct, the ownership of all of its lands, titles, and wealth defaults to the king. And then the king can do whatever he wants with him. Either keep them for himself or redistribute them to other people. So when Aegon impregnated Aelena, he wasn't just enabling Aelena to receive House Plum's wealth. He was interfering with a process that would have resulted in himself receiving House Plum's wealth. If I were inclined to try to deprive Aegon of that sacrificial element of his actions, what we might fairly call a sort of heroism, I might say something like, it didn't have to be Aegon. It could have been any man. And so Aegon still benefited from the situation by getting to have sex with Aelena Targaryen. Overlooking the fact that Aelena Targaryen is Aegon Targaryen's cousin, Aegon was actually one of very few, if not the only, person at the wedding who could have impregnated Aelena in order to save House Plum from extinction without causing major political problems. Because Aegon was the king at the time. And as the king, he's above criticism. Both Aegon and Aelena knew that Aegon was the only one who could rescue her from failing to inherit House Plum's wealth by impregnating her. Because after the deed is done, and Aegon denies that it ever happened, no one is going to dare say, under the reign of King Aegon, that King Aegon did this thing that he said he didn't do. So House Plum's secret was safe, and likely for a long time, because in all likelihood, Aegon's reign was going to last for a long time. Nobody had any reason to expect that he was going to die or be killed anytime soon. And the king being above criticism was a fact about kinghood that I assumed was at play in that rape scene that never happened. When I supposed that after Aegon raped Aelena, Aegon could rely upon the silence of anybody who knew about it, being the king. But as it turns out, the same fact of the king being above criticism is doing work in the final assessment to preserve Aegon's heroism in this situation. where Aegon managed to find a way to put his kingly freedom from criticism to work towards a selfless end, to rescue House Plum from extinction, and to seal the secret in the annals of history with the duration of his reign. Now let's grab A Storm of Swords, Daenerys 5. Page 647. Brown Ben laughed. I have me a drop of the dragon blood myself, you know. You? Dany was startled. Plum was a creature of the free companies, an amiable mongrel. He had a broad brown face with a broken nose, and a head of nappy gray hair, and his Dothraki mother had bequeathed him large dark almond-shaped eyes. He claimed to be part Braavosi, part Summer Islander, part Ibonese, part Cohoric, part Dothraki, part Dornish, and part Westerosi. But this was the first she had heard of Targaryen blood. She gave him a searching look and said, How could that be? Well, said Brown Ben, there was some old plum in the Sunset Kingdoms who wed a dragon princess. My grandmama told me the tale. He lived in King Aegon's day. Which King Aegon? Dany asked. 5 Aegons have ruled in Westeros. Her brother's son would have been the 6th, but the usurper's men had dashed his head against the wall. 5, were there? Well, that's a confusion. I could not give you a number, my queen. This old Plum was a lord, though. Must have been a famous fellow in his day. The talk of all the land. The thing was, begging your royal pardon, he had himself a cock 6 foot long. The 3 bells in Dany's braid tinkled when she laughed. You mean inches, I think. Feet, Brown Ben said firmly. If it was inches, who'd want to talk about it now, your grace? Dany giggled like a little girl. Did your grandmother claim she'd actually seen this prodigy? That the old crone never did. She was half Ibonese and half Cohoric. Never been to Westeros. My grandfather must have told her. Some Dothraki killed him before I was born. And where did your grandfather's knowledge come from? One of them tales told at the teat, I'd guess. Brown Ben shrugged. That's all I know about Aegon the Unnumbered, or old Lord Plum's mighty manhood, I fear. I best see to my sons. Go do that, Dany told him. So I read that passage last time and talked about it. But I wanted to say some more about it. I said that passage informs the Ossifer Plum and Elena situation in a number of ways. One way is that it tells me that Ossifer Plum was the talk of the land. The first time you read this passage, you'll assume that the reason he was the talk of the land was because he had a cock that was 6 foot long. Then you might think, well, that's impossible. He couldn't have had a cock 6 foot long. But maybe he just had a really big cock, and that could still be the reason he was the talk of all the land. Brown Ben Plum's grandmama and grandfather either inherited or created this story about Ossifer Plum having a cock 6 foot long. And they passed the story along to Brown Ben, the next Plum generation. And it's the fact that members of House Plum themselves created and passed down this cock 6 foot long formulation that proves that House Plum wants to preserve the knowledge that their heritage is Targaryen rather than Plum, even while their claim to House Plum would be forfeit if they ever admitted to their Targaryen heritage officially. And it's a really clever formulation, and it shows me that House Plum are aware of the same key insight that we're exploring right now. House Plum is aware that history is written by the winners, and because of it, Aegon bashing is in vogue. So the knowledge that Aegon is their ancestor needs to be conveyed in a way that sounds like Aegon bashing. And that's what this cock 6 foot long story does. Obviously, Ossifer Plum's cock could not have actually been 6 foot long. But when a person dies, he's buried 6 feet underground. So the story refers to the fact that Ossifer Plum died on his wedding night from arousal. And that's a fact that both versions of the story agree upon. They only disagree on whether he died before he impregnated Aelena or after. Because if he died before, he couldn't have been the one who impregnated Aelena. So ostensibly his cock was long enough to reach beyond the grave to impregnate Aelena. Because since Viserys was conceived and born, apparently Aelena was impregnated that night after all. And she was. Notably absent from the description is that Aegon did the impregnating instead of Ossifer. But House Plum's story survives the translation, because Aegon is a man, and a man is about 6 foot long. So even after that translation, the story obeys the ruling Targaryen line's need to bash Aegon by calling Aegon a cock. This time, cock meaning jerk. Now I want to try something a little different. Using a search of Ice and Fire, I'm going to search for the name Aelena and see if I can find some more places in the main series where this Ossifer Plum and Aelena situation is referenced that might contain some complete the rhyme clues, or any sort of clues that we can see how the main series and this World of Ice and Fire companion book, whatever, the world book, are relating to each other, referring to each other, and all that cool stuff. So here we go. Let me, there we go. Baelor. She is not referenced in the main series. Dang. Let's try to find Ossifer. Let's actually close out these other ones. Feast Cersei 3, and Ossifer Plum was much too dead, but that did not stop him fathering a child, did it? So I already analyzed that one. I'm going to move on. The Winds of Winter, Lane 1. Sir Ossifer speaks truly. Wait, there's an Ossifer in the story? Who's alive? Ossifer Lipps is the dullest knight in the Vale. So he's a knight of the Vale, and he's dull. And he said that Sansa is the most beautiful. He said that Elaine is the most beautiful maid in all the 7 kingdoms. While staring at her chest. If you don't like Sir Ossifer or Sir Uther, marry one of them instead. Well, that's the only one there is. There's just an Ossifer. So let's look at him. Maybe he's mirroring Ossifer Plum in some way. There's a large grizzled man with a round belly. He's a knight from House Lipps. This is the Winds of Winter. Summoned by Lord Robert Arryn, Sir Ossifer arrives at the gates of the moon, to compete in the tourney for the Brotherhood of Winged Knights. While flirting with Miranda Royce, he is interrupted by Elaine Stone, who rescues her friend from his unwanted advances. So Miranda did not want to be pursued by him. Alright. I think I've got this Ossifer Lipps thing mostly figured out. It starts in A Feast for Crows. Page 618. It's the Elaine chapter. The first Elaine chapter ever. Or you could call it Sansa 2. Miranda Royce is talking to Elaine Stone. And Elaine Stone is the fake identity of Sansa Stark. She's pretending to be the bastard daughter of Peter Baelish, Littlefinger. And Miranda says, our cousin Bronze Yon had himself a melee at Runestone. Miranda Royce went on, oblivious. A small one, just for squires. It was meant for Harry the heir to win the honors, and so he did. Harry the heir? Lady Waynwood's ward, Harold Harding. I suppose we must call him Sir Harry now. Bronze-Yon knighted him. Oh. Elaine was confused. Why should Lady Waynwood's ward be her heir? She had sons of her own blood. One was the Knight of the Bloody Gate, Sir Donal. She did not want to look stupid, though, so all she said was, I pray he proves a worthy knight. Lady Miranda snorted. I pray he gets the pox. He has a bastard daughter by some common girl, you know. My lord father had hoped to marry me to Harry, but Lady Waynwood would not hear of it. I do not know whether it was me she found unsuitable, or just my dowry. She gave a sigh. I do need another husband. I had one once, but I killed him. You did? Elaine said, shocked. Oh yes, he died on top of me. In me, if truth be told. You do know what goes on in a marriage bed, I hope? She thought of Tyrion, and of the Hound, and how he'd kissed her, and gave a nod. That must have been dreadful, my lady. Him dying. There, I mean, whilst he was fucking me? She shrugged. It was disconcerting, certainly, not to mention discourteous. He did not even have the common decency to plant a child in me. Old men have weak seed, so here I am, a widow, but scarce used. Harry could have done much worse. I dare say that he will. Lady Waynwood will most likely marry him to one of her granddaughters, or one of Bronze-Yon's. So there's Miranda Royce and Elaine, or Randa, and Sansa in disguise. She prefers to be called Randa. You can probably tell why. So it's a situation where a woman was having sex with an old lord that she just married on at the bedding of their wedding night, and the old lord died having sex. He died at the bedding, let's say. It's a situation so similar to Elena and Ossifer's situation from over 100 years ago that we could fairly call it a historical rhyme. Or parallel, if you like. The rhyme is something like, Old Lord dies from arousal at the bedding of his wedding to his noble bride, and fails to impregnate her. Sansa says that it must have been dreadful for Miranda, but Miranda's it was disconcerting response stopped short of dread, indicating that although the experience was unpleasant, it was not traumatic for her. So to complete the rhyme, maybe this is a clue that Ossifer Plum's death was not traumatic for Elena Targaryen either. And then Miranda's comment, he did not even have the common decency to plant a child in me, suggests that Miranda would have preferred it if her husband was successful at impregnating her, even though he died while doing it, and even though Miranda comes away from the situation a widow, and even though the baby would have been fatherless. It shows me that Miranda's main interest in the marriage was in inheriting her husband's house and properties. And so to complete the rhyme, or in other words, to take a known from this situation and import it to the Elena and Ossifer situation to help us understand that one. This instance is a clue that Elena's main interest was the same one. But by now we already knew that. And then this Miranda situation is brought up again in the Winds of Winter. So, spoilers for the Winds of Winter. Skip ahead to the time on the screen if you want to skip the Winds of Winter passage. Peter was not at the quintains, nor anywhere in the yard, but as she turned to go, a woman's voice called out, "Elaine!" cried Miranda Royce, from a carved stone bench beneath a beech tree, where she was seated between two men. She looked in need of rescue. Smiling, Elaine walked toward her friend. Miranda was wearing a gray woolen dress, a green hooded cloak, and a rather desperate look. On either side of her sat a knight. The one on her right had a grizzled beard, a bald head, and a belly that spilled over his sword belt where his lap should have been. The one on her left was no more than 18, and skinny as a spear. His ginger-colored whiskers only partially served to disguise the angry red pimples that dotted his face. The bald knight wore a dark blue surcoat emblazoned with a huge pair of pink lips. The pimply ginger lad countered with 9 white seagulls on a field of brown, which marked him for a Shet of Gulltown. He was staring so intently at Miranda's breasts that he hardly noticed Elaine until Miranda rose to hug her. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," Miranda whispered in her ear, before she turned to say, "Sirs, may I present you the Lady Elaine Stone?" "The Lord Protector's daughter," the bald knight announced, all hearty gallantry. He rose ponderously. "As full as lovely as the tales told of her, I see." Not to be outdone, the pimply knight hopped up and said, "Sir Ossifer speaks truly. You are the most beautiful maid in all the 7 kingdoms." It might have been a sweeter courtesy had he not addressed it to her chest. "And have you seen all those maids yourself, sir?" Elaine asked him. "You are young to be so widely traveled." He blushed, which only made his pimples look angrier. "No, my lady, I am from Gulltown." "And I am not, though Elaine was born there." She would need to be careful around this one. "I remember Gulltown fondly," she told him, with a smile as vague as it was pleasant. To Miranda, she said, "Do you know where my father's gotten to, perchance?" "Let me take you to him, my lady." "I do hope you will forgive me for depriving you of Lady Miranda's company," Elaine told the knights. She did not wait for a reply, but took the older girl arm in arm, and drew her away from the bench. Only when they were out of earshot did she whisper, "Do you really know where my father is?" "Of course not. Walk faster. My new suitors may be following." Miranda made a face. "Ossifer Lipps is the dullest knight in the Vale, but Uther Shet aspires to his laurels. I am praying they fight a duel for my hand and kill each other." Elaine giggled. Surely Nestor Royce would not seriously entertain a suit from such men. "Oh, he might. My lord father is annoyed with me for killing my last husband and putting him to all this trouble. It was not your fault he died. There was no one else in the bed that I recall." Elaine could not help but shudder. Miranda's husband had died when he was making love with her. That is so funny. Miranda Royce is a riot. So since I know by now that Elena's reason for marrying Ossifer Plum was that she meant to intercept the Plum fortune by becoming pregnant with a male Plum heir, one thing Elena's defenders in the audience are likely to say is that it wasn't Elena's fault that Ossifer died from his arousal. As if to echo the audience's defense of Elena, Elaine offers the same defense to Miranda after Miranda describes her husband's death as a killing. "My lord father is annoyed with me for killing my last husband and putting him to all this trouble. It was not your fault he died. There was no one else in the bed that I recall." So Miranda seems to take pride in causing her husband's death, and that feeling of pride seems entangled with the satisfaction of annoying her father, because her father arranged her marriage to the old lord. Now that the old lord is dead, along with her father's political arrangements, her father has to find and arrange a new marriage for her and House Royce. So this interaction between Elaine and Miranda informs the Ossifer and Elena situation with a twist that I suspected was there ever since I learned that Elena was vying for House Plum's wealth. Elena was trying to kill Ossifer Plum on purpose by overexciting him so that she wouldn't have to wait for him to die of old age before she could inherit House Plum's wealth. Or before people learned that the baby was a girl, in the event that the baby was a girl. But since I know that the baby was a boy, Viserys Plum, Elena Targaryen apparently won the coin toss. And now I have a good clue to the answer to a question that I've secretly been wondering about since I first read about it. In The World of Ice and Fire, Maester Yandel wrote, Later, scurrilous rumors came to suggest that Lord Plum, in fact, died at the sight of his new bride in her nakedness. This rumor was put in the lewdest terms, terms which might have amused Mushroom, but which we need not repeat, and that the child she conceived that night was by her cousin Aegon, he who later became King Aegon the Unworthy. What did Mushroom write about Olenna's nakedness that was so lewd that Maester Yandel felt he had to exclude it from the official historical record? If it's true that Olenna was trying to kill Ossifer Plum on purpose by overexciting him, the lewdness of Mushroom's terms, whatever it is probably a more truthful description of what happened. So in that case, Maester Yandel is characterizing Mushroom as a silly pervert in order to hide the real reason for excluding the detail of Olenna's nakedness. If the lewdness resides as much or more so in Olenna's actions while naked than in her nakedness itself, then it's a detail that would be troublesome for a historian who's trying to depict Olenna as a victim. Another character in this scene is Uther Shet, and he's fixated on Miranda's and Elaine's breasts. His fixation on both of their breasts, or maybe I should say both of their pairs of breasts, directs my attention to breasts in general, maybe signaling which part of Olenna's nakedness attracted Ossifer Plum's attention too. Or maybe not. I'm not completely settled on this interpretation of this passage, because there are still a few things I want to know about it and don't. Like, why is Uther Shet's name Uther Shet? But it fits well enough to explain why Elaine Stone's name is Elaine Stone. Because Elaine sounds like Olenna. As if Ossifer Lipps' name wasn't enough to signal, hey, there's some history repeats over here if you want to play, if you want to work the puzzle. So anyway, that's about as far as I've gotten with the Ossifer Plum Olenna Targaryen puzzle for now. So now I want to show you some improvements I made to that Targaryen lineage tree of histories written by the victor chart that I was drawing, because I found some mistakes on that chart that I made, and I've corrected them, I believe. So let me open that and I'll show you. So like I said before, the tree changes depending on which era of history you're standing in. This chart is for people who are standing in the present day, the reign of Tommen the First Baratheon. So that's for us. You can see where it says, you are here. And the line gets broken once it goes to Rhaella, because she's a woman. Women can't really inherit. So that's one of the reasons Robert's drop of Targaryen blood claim is weak. But hey, a Targaryen's a Targaryen, and he won through conquest, so do something about it. Yeah. Jaehaerys II and Aerys II, they get gray boxes because of Robert's conquest. Robert's rebellion. Aegon the IV actually gets a box. That was a big mistake that I made. So what correcting this chart forced me to do was to better define what I mean when I say history is written by the victor. Because it depends what you mean by victor. One thing you could mean is who came out looking like the good guy. And another thing you could mean is who came out looking legitimate. And sometimes those two purposes are at odds for the historian. Where trying to make somebody look like the good guy would actually interfere with your more important goal of trying to make them look legitimate. And that's why Viserys II is excluded from the book The Lives of Four Kings by Maester Cave. In short, Viserys II was so darn evil that the historian could barely fill up one page before he realized he had to stop. So up here is the key. This is some rudimentary definitions of what the lines mean. A legitimate claim is a male conceived by a current legitimate Targaryen and his current wife. So let's see, this is the same chart, but modified for Aerys II. So this is the chart you would want to use if you're trying to understand politics during the era of the rule of Aerys II, the Mad King. And then this is the chart you would want to use if you're trying to understand politics during the era of Baelor I, the Blessed. What does this say up here? A guide for history writing and keeping your head on your shoulders. Maegor the Cruel. This one's interesting. Balon Targaryen, the son of Jaehaerys, was never a king, but all of the kings after Balon need Balon's claim to be legitimate. They need him to be the legitimate son of Jaehaerys I, the conciliator, in order to make their own claim look legitimate. Because if his claim isn't legitimate, then yours isn't. So it's kind of interesting that somebody who is not even a king can get a red box, and have his legitimacy be so important to the ruling line of succession. I think the same situation probably comes up in the next Aegon the IV puzzle that I'm trying to tackle about Lord Butterwell and his 3 daughters and a dragon egg. That'll be a future episode someday. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching, and I hope you got something out of it. I had a lot of fun. This story's awesome. I'll see you next time.